A mason tender's day starts very early. In order to set up, stock material, build scaffold, and mix and distribute mortar to the pans or boards, a mason tender needs to be on the job well before the masons. When the masons report for their shift, their masonry materials must be ready for them to start their work. In general, the mason tender's job is to keep the masons supplied and working without delay. In order to perform your job as a mason tender efficiently and safely, you must have proper tools and safety equipment available. Personal protective equipment includes a hard hat, eye protection, hearing protection, work gloves, work boots, and if mixing mortar or dry saw cutting, you'll need a respirator. Some of the common tools used by a mason tender include tempering cans, claw hammer, tin snips, keel, water buckets, cleaning brushes, tape measures, wire cutters, tool belt, and short and long handle flat shovels. A good tender knows what the mason will need long before it goes into the wall. A mason tender needs to be able to read the wall. This means he needs to gather information about the project from the prints and from the supervisor to determine all of the materials needed for the wall. When setting up a wall, the tender often uses a mental checklist. How many and what type of block or brick are needed? What type of wall anchors, fasteners, and reinforcement are needed? Do we need flashing or weep holes? Where and what size cuts are needed? The answers to these questions will help a mason tender accurately estimate the type of materials needed, as well as the quantity of those materials. The materials will need to be stacked in place and ready for the masons. Place the material close to the work area for easy access. Masons shouldn't have to transport the supplies they need. The supplies should be ready for them in easy reach. You'll want to stack the materials on a level surface so they won't become unstable. At this point, you can set up the mud pans and board approximately 7 feet apart and begin the block stacking procedure. The block width will determine how many can be placed aside of one another. When block is stacked side by side, the width of the stack should not exceed 5 feet, and the height should not be more than 4 feet. Any taller than that, and the stack becomes unstable. When stocking brick at ground level, the same procedure is used. Since brick does not take up as much room as block, mortar boards can be placed at closer intervals. Brick bundles should be placed with a forklift or with a brick buggy. Never try to move heavy loads by hand. Use a mechanical lifting device as much as possible. Once you have the brick and block in place, it's time to set up a masonry saw. Once brick and block are cut, they will need to be stacked where they will be placed. Cut bricks and blocks are usually placed on corner leads, doorways, window openings, and expansion joints. So, find an appropriate spot for the masonry where most of the masonry material will be placed. Next, stack wall reinforcement and expansion joint material. This material should be placed near the work, but not in the way of the brick and block and mortar board setup. When it is needed, this material can be handed to the mason. The mortar mixer and the mixing materials should be placed in close proximity of the work for quick transfer to the mud boards. But make sure the location of the mixer and mixing materials will not interfere with the mason's activities. Don't forget the scaffold building material. When the wall construction reaches a certain height from the ground, the masons will not want to wait for the scaffolding to be erected to continue building the brick or block structure. The masons should be able to let you know when they will require the scaffold. Have it ready for them when they need it. If all the materials are in place and ready to go, the mason should never have to ask for material. When a certain item is needed, the mason should only have to turn around to find it. After the mortar boards and pans and block and brick are set up, start mixing some mortar for placing on the mortar boards. The tender must always wet the boards or pans before putting mortar on them. This will keep the mortar from drying out too quickly. Only a small amount of water is needed, just enough to dampen without puddling. A common method for transporting mortar from the power mixer to the mud boards is by using a wheelbarrow. On smaller jobs, the mortar may be mixed in the wheelbarrow. The shovel is often used for placing mortar from the wheelbarrow onto the mud board. It is important to get some mud on every board so that the masons can start their turn in the line. Don't fully load one board and leave the others empty. Each board or pan will hold 4 to 5 shovels of mortar. As you place fresh mud, don't just shovel new on top of old. Take the time to mix them together to ensure that the masons have a good, consistent, pliable mortar to work with. When mortar has begun to harden on the boards or in the pans, it becomes necessary to temper it. This involves turning the mortar over and over repeatedly while adding small amounts of water to bring it back to the right consistency. The best tool for this job is a square-pointed shovel. Turn over the mortar that is on the bottom and move it to the top. Another responsibility a mason tender must accept is keeping the work area clean. With all the trash and clutter that accumulates, this is not easy on a construction site. If you have a forklift on the job, keep your leftover materials on pallets so they can be moved or restocked on the wall by the machine. All wall ties should be gathered up regularly rather than allowing them to become scattered around the site. If you're working around a concrete floor, place sand on the floor before beginning work on the walls. This will make cleanup a lot easier for any mortar that falls on the floor. When the job requires masonry work to be done above finished work below, such as sills, window frames, finished floors, etc., you can save hours of cleanup time by placing a sheet of inexpensive plastic, poly, or paper over the lower work. At the end of the day, the mason tender takes on the shutdown responsibilities. These include gathering up all the tools and accounting for them, cleaning them, and locking them safely away for the next shift. Remember that mortar is easy to clean off while it is still wet, but when it hardens, it will have to be chipped off with a hammer. Place a tarp or plastic sheet over the cement and lime. Rain and snow can easily ruin material if it is not covered. Most contractors will provide a long chain and lock. The chain can be woven through the wheels of all the wheelbarrows, brick buggies, through scaffold frames, certain mixer components, and the stationary masonry saw, and secured with a lock. Mason tending is a fast-paced job. It requires good planning skills and the ability to look ahead to stay one step ahead of the masons. An experienced mason tender can make the job look easy. He knows in advance what to do next. He has all the needed materials in place. A good tender probably knows as much about constructing the wall as the mason does. Through experience and by learning the tricks of the job, you can save time and work much more efficiently.